So, about this one movie called Collateral Beauty, yeah. Um, yeah, the title is quite strange and vague, isn't it? And sure enough, I just noticed that apparently critics hated that. You know what? You know what? Yeah, I mean they hated despite the profit and the apparent audience likability of it. Yeah, I can see sort of, I can see what attracts audience, and I can see why critics do not like it. Yeah, sure enough, there are two sides, and I could sort of see, I could sort of see, I think it's sort of like it's sort of like I think it could be called the Clannad effect, as in the anime, Yeah, it does something very similar in animation form, of course. Um, and that's the thing, it does too much, so it's too intense. That's pretty much the biggest flaw, really, and it does go too far, shall we say? It does indeed. So does Planet, and I always try to differentiate. I mean, there are all sorts of media that have pathos in them, right? So this is the the attempt at making the audience feel sad, right? Practically, which is through the medium of pathos, and which is of course where pathology comes from, which of course is about disease. So, yeah, that's the thing. So, I mean, if only they didn't just go too far. So, Planet went to find my opinion, although apparently audiences love it as well. The second season, of course, went too far specifically. Um, on the other hand, another animated movie that didn't go too far, I think, that didn't manipulate emotions but still had pathos, was Grave of the Fireflies, I think, which actually was somewhat based on reality, but it didn't go too far, I thought, you know. Whereas this did, particularly because they just kept on going on and on about it. Like, if only there was just a single case, like Will Smith's case, with his daughter, that wouldn't have gone too far. Then somehow there was Simon as well, and there were people in the group. I mean, okay, the group is, it's understandable. But, and then at the end, they kept on mentioning it and again and again. Like, Simon mostly was a bit too much, and it's the same thing. It's the same. Like, I know there's a million variations of that. I'm not even sure if they mentioned what variation is, but I mean it does go too far, way too far, and you can sort of see. I mean, it still attracted audiences, sure enough, but you could see why. I mean, it's not like it didn't do what it intends to do. So it's the sort of thing is called like tearjerker, and indeed that's what it does. Indeed, just literally. But Grave of the Fireflies could be said to be that as well, and it's natural. It's much more natural. So it's sort of warranted as opposed to artificial. I always thought the what this movie or planet tries to do as well is artificial. This movie was slightly more realistic, slightly more natural than Planet actually. Planet, I mean, this movie was said to be fantasy drama. I don't think it's technically fantasy. I mean, sure, some people might think that maybe they really existed, but obviously they didn't. The representations of those abstract entities it is, but he might have really believed them and such. Ultimately, though, it's not even magical realism. I think it's entirely it's psychological, basically, but it's not fantasy still. And well, I mean, in comparison to Planet, that was far more fantastic, and it's what ruined it though in the end. Um, yes. same thing, by the way, with Angel Beat. It's even worse, actually, in my opinion. It tries to do a lot in a shorter period, and it's honestly just. But all of them apparently are really liked by audiences, and I suppose they all have this in common: this attempt at inducing pathos, at trying this. But ultimately, a natural sort of thing would have been better. If it was natural, but it really didn't feel natural. That's the problem. And so it's better though if you know just I mean, make it as realistic as possible, but do not. So I mean, I'm not saying they shouldn't have made representations of those abstract entities. That still maintains reality. That's not specifically what I'm referring to, but they the problem with this movie clearly is that it tried to go too far with too many cases specifically. That I think clearly, like even when a single case, like even a mention of the word is well, it's a horrible thing, obviously, right? As one can see, I haven't even mentioned it yet, but it's and even if it's mentioned in a comedy specifically, for example, right? Usually it obviously gets the comedy down, as in, this isn't a comedy, so that's not the point here. That's not a problem. What it tries to do, it achieves, but it goes too far, and that's clearly. I mean, so as much as critics want to say that it's a bad movie, I'm assuming they did possibly um you know it, it did what it intends to do, even for the critics. They just thought that it went too far, which it did. Obviously, I'm assuming maybe the screenwriters didn't think it was too far, but I think it might indeed be. I mean, this is ultimately a realistic scenario. Thousands die of such conditions, children as well. So in this sense, it's not doing something that many people. So even if all those parents went to watch this movie, that alone might account for its popularity in this sense, and for the profit it made. Ultimately, you know it certainly made it more interesting than simply having it just about some company, advertising executive and whatever the board meetings were about. I mean, that would have been interesting. So, in a sense, it was interesting. It was interesting to personalize those abstract entities, the letters he wrote. I mean, that was interesting. They just went a bit too far, with the case of Simon, such a chattel. I think that's the problem. But otherwise, yeah, it's a bit like also Anohana. In fact, it's I think it's most similar to it, because that there people also go through this change, and they come to accept such a similar condition. At least though it wasn't this specific, it wasn't a disease that did it, so it's slightly easier in that sense. And they didn't go too far. So Anohana, in my opinion, is better made, in addition to being animated, so it's kind of always better. But they're very similar in this sense, but similar thing doesn't happen. So there's no personification as such, but people get to learn to accept and such. It's so yeah, it's sort of interesting, but they're a bit, this kind of thing is a bit difficult to, I guess, to. I mean, people cannot just say it's entertainment. Really, people don't just enjoy it; they experience it more than enjoy it. Kind of like Schindler's List. It's really just pure drama, really. But it does do a bit too much, really. Yeah.